Hello, I'm Nana Sajaia, and on behalf of the Center for Russian Studies, welcome to this series of interviews on Russia. Today, we'll be speaking with Mike McFaul, professor at the Stanford University, who served as the United States ambassador to Russia under President Barack Obama. Ambassador McFaul, thank you very much for finding time. We started this series of interviews on Russia last fall. And when we started these interviews, I envisioned the interview with you as something totally different. And a lot has changed since then. What a difference a couple months can make in the history. My thought of the interview with you was a large discussion of your book, From Cold War to Hot Peace.
Great.
But since so much happened since then, let me start where you left. And I'm holding 2019 edition with your updated epilogue. And you end it saying, and I quote, "The hot peace, tragically, but perhaps necessarily, seems here to stay," end of quote. How did we get from hot peace to war in Europe, in Ukraine?
Well, I'd forgotten that I wrote that sentence, so thank you for reminding me. Tragically, even that ending of the book was too optimistic. Because I did think there was a way to manage a hot peace, but now we have a hot war, the worst war we've had in Europe since World War II. I think the way we got there is because of Putin and his worldview and his set of ideas about the world that I wrote about in quite detail in that book. You know, there are some Americans, maybe in Georgia too, that are analysts about international relations. And they don't think that individuals matter. They don't think that ideas matter. They don't think that regime type matters. It's just powers, great powers in the international system, and they behave in certain ways. And, you know, Russia's just behaving like any great power in the past. And I, of course, acknowledge that power matters. And without the power to invade Ukraine, this war wouldn't happen, right? Moldova, for instance, doesn't have the power to invade Ukraine, so power matters. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think what is missing sometimes in our analyses here in the West is that individuals matter and ideology matters. And in this tragic case in Russia today, you have a leader in charge, Vladimir Putin, who has fundamentally anti-democratic ideas and fundamentally imperial ideas about Russia and Russia's place in the international system and Russia's place in its neighborhood. So, you know, there are other factors we can talk about, but the main driver, tragically, for why Putin invaded was because of those very strange ideas he has about Russians as an imperial country and Russia as a bulwark against democratic nations around the world, in Europe, and on his border in Ukraine.
You've been uniquely positioned to, on the one hand, study Russia, and on the other hand, you've been part of the administration under President Obama, and you served as the ambassador to Russia. So you do come with an extensive, rich academic background and knowledge of Russia and Russian that not many experts, especially in this town, have. But you also were a part of a historic moment, I would say. In 2008, for the first time since the end of the World War, borders of a sovereign country in Europe changed by use of force. And less than a year after that, President Obama launched a reset policy with Russia. You have talked about it in years after 2019, but in hindsight, when we look back today, do you think it was a mistake to consider Russia as a regional power? And was a reset a strategic mistake?
Well, I would go back farther and say, in retrospect, it was a mistake for the West to not do everything that we could when we had the power to do so, to bring in all countries and who with democratic and European aspirations, both to engage them more deeply and to provide them with the military assistance necessary to deter attacks from Russia, be it Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, or Ukraine in 2022. So I think you can go way back well before 2008 to say that was a strategic mistake shared by Democrats and Republicans together. I was always a supporter of assisting nations that wanted to become democratic, by the way, including Russia in the 1990s. I think people need to remember that Russia was ruled by a different set of leaders back then with different aspirations, but also to provide more military assistance and security and enhance your security relationships with all countries that wanted to have that kind of relationship with the United States. That manifested itself initially in debates about NATO expansion, but it was bigger than that. It was about should we lean in to do this, or should we try to engage with countries in the region and with Russia at the same time? Remember, when your country was tragically invaded and the borders were changed, although no serious country has recognized those changes in the international border. I think that's important to remember. But President Bush was president. I was working on the campaign at the time, and he made the decision to not sanction any Russians. There was zero sanctions in 2008, as you know, and they were very tepid about military assistance. I thought that was a mistake at the time. I testified about that September 2008. It's on the public record. When we came to power several months later, we had a big debate about what should be our policy towards Russia and Ukraine and Georgia. And our then Vice President Biden announced that policy at the Munich Security Conference in February of 2008. And everybody remembers the word reset, just like you did. And nobody ever reads the second paragraph of his speech, which was all about Georgia and how we were not going to trade our security relationships with Georgia and Ukraine to have a better relationship with Russia. And that was our policy. Now, should we have done more to deepen our military relationship with Georgia at the time? My answer is yes, we should have. And so should have President Trump. And so should President Biden today. That's my personal view. But I think it would be a giant misunderstanding of our policy to frame it as we wanted to have better relationships with Russia, and so we abandoned our relationships with Georgia and Ukraine. That was not my understanding of the policy. My understanding of the policy was that we were going to engage with Russia when it was in America's national interest. And if we could seek outcomes that made the American people more secure by dialogue with Russia, we should do that. And we did, by the way. We negotiated a New START treaty that made Americans safer. At least that's my view. You can't have a New START treaty without negotiating with Russia. We put in place the most comprehensive multilateral sanctions against Iran ever in 2010, ever in the history of sanctions against Iran up to that date. You can't do that if Russia's not supporting you. They have a seat on the UN Security Council. We massively expanded the Northern Distribution Network, which, by the way, also Georgia was involved in that. But we expanded the northern route through Central Asia, through Russia, to arm and transport our soldiers to Afghanistan. You can't go through Russia without Russia giving you permission to do so. We always thought, and we deserve criticism if we fail at this. We always thought, and we always said, President Obama first and foremost, that we were never going to link issues, that we were never going to trade issues. As I said once flippantly, we'll never throw Georgia under the bus to have a warm and fuzzy relationship with Moscow. And I believe sincerely that when President Obama was president, that was our policy. The Russians, of course, always wanted to link issues that were separate. They wanted to link the New START treaty to acknowledging a sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union, for instance. I remember that conversation vividly with Russian diplomats. We always rejected linkage in those spaces. but could we have done more in the parallel track, as I write about in the book? And when by parallel track, I mean with Georgia, with Moldova, with Ukraine. My answer to that is yes, we could have done more.
But that did not stop. That did not stop Vladimir Putin from invading Crimea. I know, and you write in your book that you've always been a believer in engaging with Russia because you believed bringing these two countries, the United States and Russia, closer would benefit in many ways. But I cannot move from Reset asking again, but Reset did not stop Putin from going into Ukraine.
Well, but you're blaming the Reset policy for Putin invading Ukraine. I think that's a very, I don't see the causal relationship between those two things. Why did Putin invade Ukraine in 2014? It was in response to the what I call the revolution of dignity, what he calls the neo-fascist coup. That had nothing to do with the Reset. Those were Ukrainians. Mustafa Naim, I know, he's a friend of mine. He started it. And that had nothing to do with our engagement or containment with Putin. And you have to ask yourself, in political science, we call it the counterfactual. Had we had a more aggressive strategy to try to contain Russia back in 2009, what would that have looked like? And would that have stopped him in 2014? So what would have happened? We would have had no START treaty. Remember, you'd have to give up certain things. We would have had no deal with Iran. We would have had a harder time fighting the war in Afghanistan. We would have dealt with, I think, a much more belligerent Russia earlier on. Well before Putin came back to power. So you got to remember, so what would have been the policy that would stop Putin? And I would say at the end of the day, Democrats and Republicans, when leaders in Moscow decide to use military force in their part of the world, American presidents have not been very effective at deterring it. And that I think is important to understand, which it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it better. But I think the cause of Putin invading Ukraine was not some good relationship with the United States. By 2014, the Reset ended in 2011. It ended 3 years before. So I'm not sure. I mean, again, my argument was always we should have more assistance to Ukraine and to Georgia, but I don't think more Stingers and more Javelins in 2014 would have stopped Putin. Tragically, I think he was had more power and more intentionality vis-a-vis Ukraine than we did, and that, of course, happened again in 2022. So Democrats, Republicans, they come and go, but we haven't been able to figure out a way to contain Vladimir Putin. And I want to be clear about my views. You said I always believe in engagement. That's not my view. My view is engagement and containment. My view is the Reset policy was stolen from Ronald Reagan. It wasn't my original idea. It's right in my colleague here at Stanford, who passed away last year. His name was George Shultz, and his policy and their policy was to engage with the Russians on things where they might achieve win-win outcomes and seek to contain them in other places. And oh, by the way, also support democratic ideas and democratic values. For me, that's what we were trying to do in the Reset. Now, I understand other people have other ways to think about it, but that was the original idea came straight from Ronald Reagan.
Just the last question on this. So you do not believe it served as an appeasement to Putin, do you?
No, we weren't appeasing Putin. What policies were appeasing him? Me appeasing Putin? Give me a break. I wrote my first anti-Putin article in March of 2020, even before he was president. I think my views on Putin have been very consistent for decades, not just when I was in the government. Why do you think Putin hates me so much? Why do you think I was the first American to get on the sanctions list? It's hard for, and I served for 5 years with Barack Obama. I don't see our policy as appeasement. I see it as trying to achieve things that were in our interests and also trying to contain their belligerent policies. And we failed at that. Let's just be clear. We failed in Syria. We failed in Ukraine. But it wasn't for trying. It wasn't that we were trying to just get along with them and not caring about places like Syria or Ukraine. It's that we had a difference of opinion. And in both of those cases, when I was in the government, and then tragically, even more dramatically, in the run-up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the entire world was trying to stop him from invading Ukraine and failed. And I think that it doesn't mean they weren't trying to stop him, but he decided that he had bigger things that he wanted to accomplish, and I hope that he fails. And now, you know, we need to make him fail. But I want to be clear. I also want to say, in retrospect, if 30 years ago, imagine 30 years ago, not even in 2008, well before Putin was the leader of Russia, that we were delivering the kind of military assistance to Ukraine 30 years ago that we are doing today, that I think would have been a proper strategy to deter him from invading Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. That's the mistake we made, the giant engagement. But there are many explanations for why we didn't do that. But I think in retrospect, that would have been the policy that might have stopped him.
And you mentioned sanctions, and now you are in a group with Andrei Yermak, right? It's Yermak McFaul sanctions list. You're working on sanctions packages with Yermak and other experts, both international and Ukrainian. And in your book, to draw a parallel, in your book, you recall writing a memo about sanctioning like all the people in Russia, those directly involved in military operations, heads of state-owned enterprises, and so on and so on. And then you say, my list was longer than former colleagues in Obama administration would eventually target through sanctions. And you here also speak about the unity between United States and the West Europe, saying they were not on the same page. So right. From there to today, we've seen a lot of sanctions in European Union, separately sanctioned by Britain, we see by Canada. Do you see this unity standing? There is a lot of worry in Ukraine, as you know, that topic is Ukrainian conflict, Ukraine war is fading down here in US media, especially right. with approaching elections, gas price, all these domestic issues that take over. Do you see that unity standing against Russia? Is it firm today?
Yeah, that's a very hard question. And by the way, it reminds me of this previous history we've been talking about, which we should have talked about all the way through the 90s and the 2000s, and particularly at the Bucharest summit, the NATO Bucharest summit, and after Russia's invasion of your country, and even again after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, unity among Western leaders has always been a challenge, and there's been lots of divergence opinions about how to deal with Vladimir Putin, where there has not been unity throughout that entire history, and that has always been challenging. And I think it's important that we remember that. I would say a couple of things. First, I'm impressed by the degree of unity that the NATO alliance and the free world, I would say, not just the NATO alliance, has demonstrated towards trying to figure out ways to stop Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And by that, I mean military assistance and sanctions first and foremost. The response this time was much greater than 2014. And the response in 2014 obviously was much greater than 2008, right? And so we should have started with the bigger responses earlier. So I'm impressed with what they've accomplished, and I give a lot of credit to the Biden administration behind the scenes building this coalition in support of sanctions. Our working group, just to be clear, the one that I am the coordinator of, we are an independent, nonpartisan international working group, but we closely interact with the Ukrainian government, Mr. Yermak, but we also closely interact with the Biden administration and other European countries as well. Our assignment is to think more boldly and more creatively to go beyond what governments have done so far. You could do that as a independent professor as opposed to being in the government, right? But what I would say now to answer your question, which I've evaded so far, because it's a really hard one, I worry about maintaining unity for sure, because the war has been expensive for all those countries I just mentioned. Nothing compared to the expenses to the Ukrainian people, of course, but it is becoming, as our economies are suffering, and the economy here in the United States is experiencing inflation that millions of Americans are worrying about. Opponents of the Biden administration are now blaming sanctions as part of our economic troubles. And the closer we get to our elections in November, the louder that criticism is going to be. So there's a political domestic question, domestic politics issue here in my country, and I'm sure it's playing in all other countries in Europe as well. And then number two, there's an exhaustion that is happening. Well, what more should we do? I personally think there's a lot more that should be done. And the pressure needs to continue every day. But I sense from talking to government officials in the West that there is a sense of exhaustion, and Putin understands that. Putin understands that the longer it goes on, the greater advantage he has. And remember, Putin doesn't have to face any domestic politics, right? He can make his people suffer, and he can let his soldiers die and face no public criticism because it's a dictatorship. And he is also very ideologically motivated to achieve a victory inside Ukraine. And that makes him more patient than leaders in the West.
And to continue on the sanctions group that you're coordinator of, a couple of days ago, you said the group is considering proposing sanctions on some citizens of Georgia. That was a big news in Georgian media. When we speak about Georgian citizens, what kind of people are you looking at? Who are you looking at?
First of all, I want to clarify very precisely so that it is not misinterpreted inside Georgia. Our group is an independent, nonpartisan group. We have no formal relationship with any government. We're all former officials. Most of us are professors. A lot from Ukraine, a lot from the United States, but also from Germany, Britain, Canada, and even Russians, by the way. I don't think we have a Georgian on the group. We should change that. You should help me find somebody to help us work on that.
Would love to.
But so we meet informally and we talk every week, and we have subgroups, many subgroups, by the way. And several weeks ago, a subgroup, not one that I was chairing, said that if we want to be more effective in sanctions, we have to reach beyond Russia, and citizens of Belarus, Germany, Georgia, even, I'm leaving out somewhere, but of those in particular, people suggested that we should consider recommending, right, as we do in our public papers, other people on the individual sanctions list. But we have not taken that decision. We have not written that paper. because it's very controversial. And many in our group want to keep the focus on Russians. So to date, we have chosen very deliberately not to expand our recommendations for individual sanctions to citizens of other countries besides Russia. Doesn't mean we might not recommend it in the future, but we haven't so far.
Yeah, the list of these countries that you named wouldn't come out of nowhere, right? What is the ground, like when we say citizens of Georgia, like what citizens, what are they involved in? Who are we thinking about? Who are we talking about?
Well, I think anybody, and I'm not going to name individuals until we decide to publish names. That would be improper of me. I'm a coordinator. I chose that word very precisely. I'm not the leader. I'm not the chairman. I coordinate. Everybody speaks for themselves, and so I don't want to put words into people's mouths until we have agreement. But it is our view, I would say. Well, let me just say, it's my view. I think shared by many in the working group, that if you are helping Putin's war directly or indirectly, then there should be a response to that. So if you are serving, for instance, on a board of directors of a Russian company that is helping Putin's war, then you should be held liable for helping that war. So maybe you personally are not involved, but if you're on a board and that company is helping Putin, you bear some responsibility as well. And I would point out, for instance, Mr. Schroeder in Germany, former chancellor, decided to change his affiliations with one of his boards as a result of that kind of argumentation. But there are many, many more foreigners that would fall in that category, right? Not just Georgians, and that's why I hesitated. There are many categories, even Americans, by the way, that might fall in that category if you took the policy decision to sanction not just Russians, but all those that are helping Putin, including people from other countries.
Let's call a spade a spade. Are we looking at Ivanishvili, sanctioning Ivanishvili potentially?
Well, our working group has not got to individual names, so I have no news to announce. But I would say, as I said before, any individual, any company, or in any government that is directly or indirectly aiding Putin's war in Ukraine should suffer consequences. This war is barbaric. This war is brutal. Innocent Ukrainians are dying every single day. And therefore, it's a black and white issue. There's no in between, as far as I'm concerned personally. You either support the Ukrainians and their struggle for independence and sovereignty and democracy, or you support Putin. There are no places on the sidelines as far as I'm concerned. And so if you choose indirectly to support Putin and his regime, the Western world, the democratic world, the world that believes in sovereignty should respond in kind.
Where do we go next from here?
Well, the most important thing is to stop Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I think the entire world needs to be focused on concrete strategies to achieve that objective. For me, that means more weapons for Ukraine, more sanctions, and a stronger NATO, but especially more weapons and more sanctions. But in the long run, I think we have to develop a much more sophisticated strategy for isolating Putin and his regime, even if at the same time trying to engage with parts of Russian society. So the era of trying to bring Russia into the liberal international order, that's over. We should stop pretending that he's going to change his behavior. The era of realpolitik, rapprochement, détente with Putin's Russia, I think is also over. I think there's very little that can be achieved that advance America's interests or the interests of democratic countries by engaging with Putin. There's a few issues like arms control, nuclear weapons still, and non-proliferation. Those are areas where we should talk to Moscow and the Kremlin and Putin. But on most other areas, if you involve the Russians, the Russian government, they will impede progress, not help progress. And I think that means a fundamental change in terms of grand strategy for how the West contains and deters belligerent behavior of Putin abroad. And I also think we need a much more sophisticated strategy for communicating directly to the Russian people inside Russia. We're not doing a good job about that. At least my country is not. In those information and disinformation wars, I think we have to become much, much more sophisticated.